Good morning, everybody. My name's Deborah France. I'm the Director for the ILO Bureau for Employers' Activities. I nearly said workers then. You can tell I got up at 5 this morning. And I'd like to welcome you all to the next stage in our meeting today, which is a high-level panel looking specifically at the role of the private sector in driving disability inclusion forward. Also a presentation from colleagues at the OECD. And before we get going with that, I'd like to thank all of you here today, existing network members. Thank you for your ongoing support for the network, but also those enterprises and companies who are not members of the network, who are perhaps here with us as a taster of our activities today. So welcome to you too. ILO colleagues, I see quite a few of you here, so thanks for giving up the time to come and learn with us. Also, we have in the audience a number of representatives from permanent missions and other UN agencies that we work with periodically on this issue. Welcome. And we thought it would be a good idea to take advantage of our usual network meeting to maybe widen up participation, to share with you a little bit of the work that we have been doing over the last 5 or 6 years in this area. We've worked since 2010, I think it is now, with the Business and Disability Network to try and promote disability inclusion in workplaces, especially with multinational companies, but also employer organisations, business representative organisations. The main objective of the network so far has been to share experiences and knowledge and how companies are approaching some of the challenges of managing a diverse workforce in this field. And we find that the business-to-business dialogue, the role of the ILO as a convener and a safe space, if I can put it like that, has been a way of facilitating a dialogue and knowledge sharing. We're also aiming to help the companies by producing tools and publications that they can use in their companies. Sitting where I sit in the ILO, and my day job is to interface with business representative organisations, we've also used it to make linkages, the knowledge and the relationships that we've had with the multinational companies, to actually make the linkages with employers' organisations at national level. And I know a few of you have spoken this morning, Ravi from Ceylon, from Sri Lankan employers being a key example, about how employer organisations can look at this policy issue and get it on the national radar and start using some of the tools and services with their own members. So we go up from multinationals, who are quite often in the vanguard on some of these issues, and then drag that learning through to small and medium-sized enterprises, obviously tailoring the approach, tailoring the language as appropriate, but it's a way of trying to find a way that what begins as a dialogue ends up with learning that then we can use from an ILO perspective in our everyday work with constituents. So this morning we're going to hear from the Director General of the ILO, Guy Ryder, a little bit about the work of the ILO in this policy area. After that, I'd like to pass the floor to Gerard, who's our Network Steering Committee chairperson, who will talk a little bit about the work that we've done and hopefully some of the successes of the network. That's what my brief tells me anyway. Okay. And then we'll get into the panel, where we have our colleagues to the left of me who will come, and I have some questions for them just to make sure that it gets interactive. And then finally, we'll finish off with a presentation from the OECD and some of the work that they have been doing on mental health in the workplace. I know that we will leave plenty of time for questions and answers. And before I hand over to the Director General, I'd just like to say on your behalf, thank you for making the time. It's just before our governing body meeting, so I know he's got to leave us because he has a meeting of our governing body officers very shortly. And therefore, if he runs off, it's not because he's not interested in this as a policy issue, quite the reverse. And we've spent 3 hours in the car discussing it this morning. But it's rather that we also have other things to be preparing for on the eve of a governing body session. So, Guy, I'd like to pass the floor to you, if I may. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Deborah. Firstly, good morning to everybody. It is absolutely great to see this room so full as we're discussing this extraordinarily important issue, and a particularly warm welcome to the Global Business and Disability Network members. We're delighted to have you all here today. I know you got off to a great start in the meeting this morning. Sorry I couldn't be with you at the opening. It was because we were travelling back to Geneva. But I've heard you got off to a great start, and it's been already an extremely lively and productive discussion. I'm anxious not to make you lose that momentum, so I think the best thing I can do is be relatively quick. But I do want to just sort of share a few messages with you, which I hope will be of some assistance to the discussions that you're going to undertake, and then obviously pass the floor on to Gerard and to the excellent panellists and the OECD colleague who are with us. So let me just make what you might find some simplistic points. I've never been worried about being simplistic, but I think there are some important political messages I want to share with you. The first has to do, and this risks stating the obvious, the significance and importance of the issues that you are addressing here today. Without boring you with the statistics, we know that more than 1 billion people in the world experience some form of disability today. We know that prevalence of disability is rising, not decreasing, due to a varied set of factors. That includes increased chronic diseases such as diabetes, cardiovascular conditions, cancer. There are mental health-related disabilities. And at the same time, discrimination and stigma heavily impact on the lives of people with disabilities, often determining the course of their lives by effectively narrowing their choices, those that are available to them. And in those choices, of course, those that have to do with work are absolutely crucial. So here's the first point. For an organisation such as the ILO, whose business is the world of work, and whose mandate is social justice, and whose responsibility is particularly heavy towards those who face disadvantage and exclusion in the world of work, this is our business. This business that you are addressing today is our business, and so it is not business as usual. I like the title of your meeting. So you're in the right place, from my point of view, in this House, and I want you to know that everything that we hear today, we will take into our own work, we will try to learn from, we will try to increase and improve what we do. Second point is about attitudes. I see that changing, transforming mindsets and attitudes has already been part of what you have been discussing this morning. You know, I'm reminded, and it's sort of part of my own professional experience, that there was a time, not entirely a time that belongs to the past, when women were widely denied the right to work and access to equal opportunity at work. And that's an unfinished agenda, as anybody who looks at questions of pay and participation in the labour force will understand. But the fact of the matter is that for the vast majority of people, women and work are no longer incompatible, if they were, and they were at certain points. And so despite the significance of these issues, the fact is that people with disabilities are still today too frequently excluded from labour markets, and when in employment, they are too frequently in the bottom part of the pyramid of the labour force, with little support to promote and develop their career paths. And so, like women once, unfortunately, people with disabilities and work are still sometimes seen as, let's put it, an unusual combination. And so what we're dealing with is a human rights issue. It's an equality human rights issue, first and foremost. That's how I see it. But there is another aspect to all of this, and it is that the exclusion of people with disabilities from labour markets comes also at a very significant economic price, and that's estimated between 3 and 7% of GDP in our member states. And it's interesting that the publication that we're launching today, which is based on the examples of a group of companies, shows the clear benefits which do flow from employing people with disabilities, and gives also some guidance on how that can best be done. In addition to that, research shows that companies that employ people with disabilities are likely to be perceived favourably by consumers, including people with disabilities and their families. And according to recent estimates, people with disabilities and their families and their immediate social circles control more than $8 trillion in global disposable income. That too can concentrate people's minds. Ladies and gentlemen, the way we do our work in this House is through dialogue, tripartite dialogue between governments, workers and employers, who are the key actors in promoting the inclusion of people with disabilities. To say that dialogue is not always easy, and I think our governing body in the next 2 weeks might provide some examples of that reality. That being the case, the ILO recognises that effective inclusion naturally entails the participation of those with the largest labour demand. That's the private sector. Multinational enterprises in particular are crucial players in the global arena, and it's great to see so many in the room today. And it's also why the Global Business and Disability Network was established, to facilitate dialogue and collaboration among employers' organisations and multinational enterprises, and through that to promote the employment of persons with disabilities within the private sector. Companies and employer networks like those present here today are probably the best ambassadors to get other companies, and I think particularly as small and medium-sized enterprises, to consider the employment of persons with disabilities as a usual business practice. I think that's the point. It's also important to highlight that the voices and expertise of people with disabilities are represented within the global network by the International Disability Alliance, and that's tremendously important. And the ILO, I'm pleased to say, facilitates this dialogue and provides its technical backup in the field. Ladies and gentlemen, through this network, the ILO has found that many employers already realise that people with disabilities are as capable and as productive as anybody else, and these employers have an extensive and invaluable first-hand experience in how effective inclusion can become a natural part of corporate and business strategy. With their know-how, they are amongst the best qualified spokespeople to carry the message to those who do not yet realise the incommensurable societal and economic benefits of the inclusion of people with disabilities in workplaces, as well as to those who do see it but don't yet know how to begin with the task of making it happen. Employers' organisations and national business networks truly are key partners in conveying the message of inclusion and providing guidance and assistance to employers on the ground. And the network provides support to employers' organisations to build their capacity to assist employers in matters relating to the inclusion of people with disabilities at the country level, particularly in developing countries. And there have been successful experiences, I think of Brazil, of Chile, in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which continue to encourage the formation of national business and disability networks. I'm currently supporting the development of that type of initiative, for example, in Zambia and in Peru. What about the ILO in all of this? Well, decent work for all, is the ILO's primary objective. With regards to the provision of guidance to our constituents, the ILO Code of Practice for Managing Disability in the Workplace has laid the foundation for concerted actions of governments, employers and workers to achieve the inclusion of people with disabilities in the world of work. And to take forward our work, we are reviewing our strategies for ILO work on disability, and we hope soon to adopt a new internal strategy and action plan in the field. And that will give us, I think, a new focus to our work and also our interface with this network and others in the room. I very much hope that that will be the way forward for us. And I want to just mention as well the normative framework within which all of this takes place. Our convention, Key Convention 159, 82 ratifications around the world. That's not bad, but it could be better as well. Let me finish by saying that undoubtedly disability is a complex, evolving concept. People with disabilities are a heterogeneous group with different types of disability, with gender, ethnicity, social and cultural factors to play in, and they face still multiple barriers that deny them access to decent employment. And so tackling these barriers requires the type of dynamic and robust approach that you're bringing to the task today. Partnership and collaboration have proven to be the effective means of action, the right way forward, and they've also allowed for exchange of knowledge in a truly mutual, supportive learning process. So let me conclude by saying that the ILO has the very, very sincere conviction that a reality in which people with disabilities are valued for their abilities and are seen as agents of productivity, innovation and competitiveness, an integral part of the world of work, is absolutely possible. And we are committed, and we invite you to share your experiences to promote the ideas on ways that we can turn all of this into the norm, not the exception. So thanks for being here. I want to sit and listen for as long as I can, but when I do depart, please excuse me, and I will be very anxious to learn what the overall outcome of your work and deliberations were here today. Thanks for being here, and good luck today.
Thanks, Director General. We thought it was important to put the work we do in an organisational context in terms of the world of work and the broader mandate of the ILO, but also it was important also for us to have the institutional support for what we're doing, given that it is very much a new way of working for the office. So thanks for taking the time to be with us. I'd like to hand over now to Gerard van der Ven of Dow Chemical, who will make a few remarks about the network. He is the steering committee chairperson and has very much been one of the leading lights in keeping us on the right track. But I know also how much we value the commitment and the energy he's been bringing to the work we do. So Gerard, the floor's yours. Thanks.
Thank you, Deborah. My brief said I had to talk about something. I've decided to go a little bit off script. I don't want to spend any time in this forum talking about either the human rights case or the business case for disability inclusion, because I'll be preaching to the choir in this room. What I do want to do is I want to spend a few minutes to talk about the ILO Global Business and Disability Network and give you the value proposition from a company's perspective of this particular network. Because the companies that are members are already convinced, active in disability inclusion. They take their responsibility very seriously. So why would they team up with the ILO and employers' organizations and NGOs? Huh? Right. I think to start off with, to my knowledge, this Business and Disability Network, facilitated by the ILO, is the only truly tripartite and truly global network and platform that I know exists. There's many disability initiatives, local scales, between companies, with interest organizations, but there's only one place that brings it all together. Right? Companies, employers' organizations, NGOs, and very relevantly, the expertise that the ILO brings. So it is a truly global collaboration platform. And I have heard the word dialogue. In my mind, dialogue is only half of what we need to do. We also need to turn the dialogue into action. And particularly the companies that are members are looking for ways to more effectively turn ideas into action. The ILO is, and we found that out in our steering committee meetings with the ILO representatives, the ILO might underestimate itself when it comes to what valuable resources brings to companies and what a reputable organization it is to be collaborating with. From a company perspective, you want to do good business, right? So the human rights case of disability inclusion is not that relevant, but the business case is all the more. And you want to tell your story, right? Because that's part of what forms your reputation and your brand. If you tell your own story, you have a certain level of credibility. If you have your story told through the ILO, through Employers Network, through work with NGOs, it becomes much more powerful. And therefore, your ability to convince others increases tremendously. Right? So what the network does, and what we aim for, is we marry the objective of companies, which is to improve the quality of business, and the objective of the ILO, which is to improve the quality of work for people. Right? And there is no conflict whatsoever. Right? So maybe a little bit more about, and we talked about that this morning, what this network offers and what the ILO offers is a global reach with connections into all sorts of different and diverse cultural and legal contexts. Because companies don't necessarily have the expertise, although they operate in a multitude of countries. Right? I spoke about that this morning. Companies enjoy benchmarking, comparing themselves to others to understand where they stand with their quality of business. With the network members, we have premier companies from different industry sectors, from different parts of the region, and we're going to try and extend that. So we have access to all sorts of best practices. Right? As a company, it has historically been very difficult to have access to, call it governmental resource and United Nations resource. This is now opened up through this network. So all the expertise, all the dialogue is accessible to us. And I think very, very much so for international companies, this network, and through the ILO, has access to local expertise of regional employers organizations and NGOs, which is critically important to turn the concept into implementation. Right? So from that perspective, if you are a business interested in disability inclusion, and you should be, because you'll hear about the business case, it makes economic and business sense, this is the network that you should look for. This is the network that you should join. So I'm hoping that I can have some conversations with prospective members in the audience, and also hoping that the people who are not part of the network, but the people in the ILO, get a bit of a feel for that potential power that the ILO has in collaborating with business to enable progress. And I think you might have underestimated that, but that realization is beginning to develop, and this network is facilitating that in a great example. So I'm proud to be here. And you will hear more from the panel discussions on the content of disability inclusions and how companies work. Those are my remarks.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Thank you. So now I'd like to get on to the panel, if I may. We have in front of us two company representatives, Ayashkant Sarangi, who's from Wipro, based in India, where he's the Vice President and Global Head of Human Resources, but also leads the Persons with Disabilities Initiative in Wipro. Anne Flagstad, who's the Senior Vice President and Organizational Change Manager of Telenor, both of the company's active, very active network members. And finally, Ronnie Goldberg, who is Senior Advisor with the US Council for International Business, well known, I think, to many of you in this room. She's been working on this policy issue with us and was in at the beginning when we sat, I can't remember how long ago, dreaming up how we could possibly put a network together that would add value for both businesses and for the ILO. She's our key link into the ILO governance structure from the business perspective, which is why, certainly from where I sit in my day job, her continuing to champion the network is so very important. Unfortunately, Javier Constante of Dow Chemical had a medical emergency and unfortunately isn't able to join us, but if anybody's got any questions for Dow, I'm sure Gerard will take those over. And given that we have not as much time because we're running over already, and I know that the panelists probably don't have or shouldn't have long prepared speeches, and we want questions from the floor. I'd like to maybe start with Ayashkant, but really just asking you to focus on a number of issues, if I may, in your interventions, that would bring a sense of what you're doing in your company. And I think one of the things in the network that we've discussed, I mean, probably in this room we're preaching to the converted, but that's not always easy within a company context. So it would be interesting to know how you ensure in your company that top-level commitment is gained to take the issue of disability inclusion forward. You know, what would you say to companies sitting in this room and outside this room? You know, what would be your message to those companies as to why this is a business issue and what should they be doing? You know, what's happened in your company on a positive impact of the initiatives that you've taken internally. And I think particularly from a multinational business perspective, multinational companies are in some ways similar, in other ways very dissimilar to international organizations. And you face the challenge of ensuring that global practices may be followed at national level. It would be interesting, what's your advice on managing a global workforce along that line, particularly in the area of disability inclusion? Have you any particular initiative that you'd want to share with us? And I think one other thing that keeps coming back at network meetings that I think would be interesting to know about as you cover your interventions is that I think a number of companies keep telling us that, look, we'd like to do the right thing. We buy the business case, we're in there, we've got top-level commitment. But we find it difficult to find people with disabilities who have the skills that we require. We are working in a competitive business environment where skills are at a premium. So what advice would you give? Because this is not just about companies acting in a box. Public authorities also have their role to play. So what are the messages you think that may be useful to pass to relevant public authorities that in partnership, dialogue, that this challenge can be addressed? So with that, perhaps if I can pass over to you, Ashkant, and you can answer all of those questions and more. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Good morning. It's an absolute privilege being here in this meeting. I think the most important piece that we look for and we have achieved to a large extent is leadership buy-in. I think that's the most important consideration for us as an organization. Acting with sensitivity, these are not 3 words in Wipro. These are our values. So today, if anyone were to go to our website and look at the values of Wipro as an organization, you'd see acting with sensitivity is one of our core values as an organization, and we want to live it and play it as is. Clearly, as an organization, as we kind of went through a massive growth over the last decade and a half, and we globalized, it was extremely important for us to look at how different each and every country is from an inclusion and diversity perspective. And more importantly, from a demand for talent perspective, we realized pretty early in the game that it's important for us as an organization to include people with disability because that's a huge talent pool for us as an organization. And secondly, when we kind of went into potentially looking at hiring them, we looked at 3 key areas for us as an organization. One is how do we build our infrastructure, which not only meant only looking at access, but also looking at our HR policies so that it's inclusive for persons with disability. We also looked at how do we sensitize our managers, our co-workers, our leadership. So for that, we kind of have right now implemented a pan-Wipro global e-learning tool, tests kind of a stuff, which kind of ensures that everybody is kind of going through it annually, is being sensitive to including people with disability. And last but not the least, creating successes out of employees with disability, which means focusing on them, highlighting their work, ensuring that their work is presented at multiple forums, both nationally and internationally. When they get recognized, ensuring that the larger organization is made aware of their successes, because it's through examples that we feel pretty strongly that we can communicate a message of equality, we can communicate a message of strength, and we can communicate a message of ability. So those, I would say, are our key focus areas as an organization. And of course, it starts with our chairman, Mr. Azim Premji, personally investing a lot of time towards ensuring that there is significant amount of focus towards this as an organization. Because as we just heard a short while ago from Mr. Guy, that this has a direct correlation to an organization being global, to an organization being an equal opportunity employer, and towards building a brand. So those I would kind of put in as my initial thoughts from my perspective.
Thank you, Deborah. Yes, listening to the kind of the first session, first part of the session today, I see that, of course, there's no silver bullet to this. And maybe our bullets is different than from your bullets, but it doesn't seem, because when I checked off our key success factors, you kind of already have been thinking of them. But in my view, there is a kind of of course, it's the Telenor way. We are a big mobile company, but not that big. We are coming from Norway, which is kind of based on the kind of equality culture, the Nordic kind of leadership style, so it's ingrained in the culture. We are still also global. We are in Asia and other parts of the world where maybe this is not as evident, you know. So I came yesterday from a session in Istanbul where we reinforce the culture of being respectful each year, going from top to bottom every year. So we all went out with this thing around our arms, you know, to be protected by the values, being respectful. So it's ingrained in the culture, really ingrained. And this is also about going from making a policy, because in one sense, making a policy is easy. Living the policy is more where the real implementation comes. And we have a long history, and maybe we have taken a more incremental approach. We started the first initiatives in 1996 in Norway. And now we have initiatives going in most of our companies, but they are a little bit different in terms of how structured they are. In some places, there are more targeted initiatives, as in GP, for instance, where we work with acid offers, survivors, which is more a kind of a smaller initiative, whereas in Norway, where we have programs running over 2 years, where we have a success rate of 75% of those participating actually getting a job in Telenor or in other companies. So it's kind of different in how we approach it. And of course, there's no size fits everybody here. So we need to be a more diversified and incremental approach. I also heard when I talked to, and I sat reflecting on kind of the speeches in the morning, and there seems to be a middle management nut here, how to crack that nut. And I think that what we see to avoid this becoming kind of charity, to get it into be real a benefit, a joint benefit for both participants and the company, expectation management is very important on both sides, on both parties, right? So in the more mature programs we have, when I or middle managers kind of take on a trainee from one of these programs, the trainee comes very clear understanding and reflections on what their limits are, what kind of adjustments they need, you know, so that we have a common platform where we have actually managed expectation on both sides before we enter into this practicing. And I think that is important, because this needs to be a joint partnership for participants and the company. And then we come back to, we also, of course, have the way of Telenor workplace model, where we have I think we are one of the few companies who didn't leave the open space office in the end of the 20s. We have actually kept them. And that turned out to be a very good asset for us now, because it's universal all over companies. We have no offices, so there's no problem to make adjustments in the physical kind of outline of the building, because we don't have any walls, so we can put in wheelchairs and everything. So that turns out to be a very good asset in this case. And we also are working heavily, because we are in this business, you know, the mobile business. We are connecting people. And our vision is to empower societies. So we also work a lot in terms of the Telenor workplace model with virtual working, making it possible for people to sit at home and work through mobile connectivity and access to internet. So we have also flexibility on that side, so that people actually can sit in their home and work and not be needed to transport it to the offices. So I think that is also some of the kind of the key success factors that we see. And you know, the point is to make this sustainable. That is where kind of the real success are. And I see that our kind of now experience from 1996, developing it incrementally, ingraining it very tightly to the Telenor culture has been very important for us. And then the final point is partnership. Because we could not do this alone. We need to partner with the government, welfare services, education institutions, our own people. So it's a kind of a joint partnership on all sides. Yes, I think that was all.
Before I open up the floor to questions, including a few of my own, picking up on some of your comments, if I may, Ronnie, can I bring you into the conversation now? And I mean, we've talked about this before in terms of your own role, where you've worked directly with a number of multinational companies who are your own members in the US. So you've also seen a cross-section of company practices that you may be able to share with us. But I think also I'd like to make the link in terms of the role to our employer organisation constituency, if I may, and what do you consider the role of employers' organisations is in promoting the employment of persons with disabilities among their members, and maybe some tips about how you can go about that with the business case.
Thank you, Deborah, and good morning to everyone. Well, good afternoon, excuse me. It's a real pleasure, and it's very exciting to be part of this meeting and to see how far we've come, actually, in a relatively short time. So I'm really honored to be part of this. I think the first thing to say about employer organizations is how numerous and diverse a population we're talking about. The International Organization of Employers has some 150 members in, I think, 142 countries. I may have the exact number a little wrong, but that's the order of magnitude. Those organizations are as diverse as the countries from which they come. Some of them have, like my own, have memberships that are almost exclusively large companies, multinationals. Others have predominantly small and medium enterprises. Some of them do a great deal of technical training and programs for their members. Others, again, like my own, operate almost exclusively at the policy level. So the first thing to say is that just as we hear over and over that there's no one-size-fits-all or magic bullet for companies, as diverse as companies and industries are, the same is true of employer organizations. And that offers both challenges, obviously, but also enormous opportunities for creativity and for learning from each other about what works in different situations. Having said that, I think, though, that there are a few things that are common or could be common to all employer organizations. The first is something that Ravi, our colleague from the Employers of Ceylon, said this morning, and that is that we can all walk the walk as well as talk the talk. We can lead by example. And by the way, everybody can do that. I have to say, I'm very impressed to see what I believe is a first here in the ILO, which is an agenda in Braille, and our colleague here doing the interpretation. We can all walk the walk in various ways. So by reflecting in our own amongst our own colleagues in our organizations, the diversity that we're preaching to our companies is a very important thing. Secondly, we can all, in each in our various ways, disseminate information to and educate our members. We can promulgate the business case and explain as the translator, as the bridge between the world of the ILO and our own world, translate the language of rights into the language of business for our members. And I actually don't think I need to say anything more about that, because I think the DG very eloquently did that himself just now. These are not competing models. They are part of the same proposition. But we talk to our members in the language they understand. And I think that's a valuable role for us. Similarly, I think we provide a safe space for our members. One of the most, I think, powerful and interesting things about the presentations this morning to me, and I'm sorry not all of you could hear them, was the willingness of the companies to talk about what doesn't work and what's hard, and the challenges they have within their own organizations, and the pushback they have from their own colleagues. That's not something that you often hear. We all like to celebrate our achievements, and we talk too little about our challenges and our failures. And I think just thinking about my own organization and the meetings we can convene among our members, we can give them the space to learn from each other with the hard things as well as the easy and successful things. Thirdly, we all, or most of us, employer organizations advocate. We advocate, of course, to our members, encouraging them to adopt the right kind of policies and practices, but also to our governments, and that's a very important thing. Whether it's advocating for things, something we've been doing lately, like the ratification of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or putting in place, this was raised this morning, a facilitating legal and regulatory environment in your own country that will help companies to reach their diversity targets. And finally, what we can do is recruit for the network, which I think is a very important thing. Not only is this important because the more companies we have, the more of a critical mass we have, the more robust will be the product we can offer to everybody. And not only because this product is a good service to our members, this is a benefit we can offer our members, but also because this public-private partnership, which the network is, has to be sustainable. Unless we have the resources, in other words, unless we get paying members, we're not going to be able to continue to grow it and to promulgate it. So this is the kind of pitch that employer organizations need to make to their own constituencies. Let me leave it at that.
And I'm glad you got to say that before the Director General left. Thanks. While the Director General leaves us, and before I hand over to any questions, perhaps I can just pick up on something you said, Ronnie, and put one question back to our two company representatives, because you both addressed it, but if I'd like to just deepen it, if I may. We talked about failures and the hard, and you talked about the incremental approach and how, you'd not run before you could walk, and just how to... Ashkant, you talked about getting commitment of senior management. Can I ask you, what would be your advice for a company or an organization, starting from the beginning, who were possibly facing resistance, working within an environment where this may be seen as yet another CSR initiative, that might be seen as the flavour of the month, and then when the going gets hard and the cuts come out, it hits the wayside and we move on to something else. I think in all organisations we sometimes suffer from that. How in your companies have you been able to sustain the business case, sustain the progress, and what would be your advice to people sitting here today on how they might start going about it in their own organisations or enterprises?
I think from our perspective, what our own experience as an organization has been that start small. It's extremely important to spend significant amount of time championing the initiative, talking about the initiative and its impact, the value, and how that would take shape to as many leaders as possible in the organization to begin with. And spend significant amount of time there till we get a couple of promoters. And once we get them on our end, leverage on them and try and make a success out of that small specific situation that or specific employee who has been on board in that specific team, and ensure that the person becomes successful, and then highlight the success of that specific individual. And the basic logic that we are using is success rubs into more success. It's only when people get convinced that it's working for team A, will team B, team C, team D kind of get into it. So my suggestion here would be to start small, identify first and foremost leaders who would be willing to champion the cause, and just never give up, and genuinely believe in the fact that because at the end of the day, from the team which is leading that initiative, it's important that they themselves are resilient about the whole initiative. They themselves believe in it 100%, and they would just never give up. So identify leaders, make success out of it. There would be challenges on the way, highlight challenges, but at the same point in time, it's important to convey a message as to how a given challenge has been overcome, because it's only through this corridor coffee room discussions, and that's when things kind of take a much larger shape here. Very simple example that I would like to showcase here. In one of our teams, we had got in an employee with ortho disability. And whenever this team used to go out for movies or parties, they would assume that this person won't be able to make it and would just never invite. And probably they thought that they're being nice and being to this specific employee. So this employee came and spoke with HR and said, look, this is what's happening on the ground to me. How do I make it work? So the advice that this employee was given was, invite your colleagues home if it's okay with you. And this person did that. But as an organization, what we did was to ensure that this was known to a lot of people as well as an organization, and not as global mass emails, but in small group settings. And those are small steps that we take to ensure that there's always continuous discussion, sensitivity around this topic on the ground.
Yes, thank you, Deborah. Yes, this is the big question of sustainability, right? Which doesn't have one answer. But I think that one should be very clear when going into this that investments needs to be done, right? This cannot happen without investments, either in time or resources. And patience and endurance make that your vision. And go step by step, celebrate as you go along, and manage expectations as you go along. What we do is that people who come from these programs into our organizations, they are not treated differently than any employee. They have the same obligations and same rights. We are not putting them on the side. They are part of the business, for the best and for the worst sometimes, because there are obviously special things we need to think about. And that is why the expectation management is so important. And when in the programs in Telenor Norway, Sweden, and Pakistan, we work a lot with the participants to coach them to be clear on what their limitations are, so that they can avoid these situations saying, you may think that I cannot come with you, but if you ask me, please ask me. So that needs to be a joint responsibility. Accountability needs to be on both parts, because otherwise this will not work in practice. This will not be sustainable, because then we will end back again and say, this didn't work. It was too much work, it didn't work, we need to stop. So we need to also make the participants able to really go in and be a regular employee. And that goes also with reflections on their side. So investments needs to be done. When it comes to the incremental approach and investments needs, we need to have someone in the company working with this, right? And not only on the policy level where I am. We need to have a center of excellence. And what we've done in Telenor, since we have experience from the end of 1990s, this group of people, which is not many, so the investments needs to be there, but it's not a whole lot of people. It's 2 or 3 people. And we export them around. You know, we in Bulgaria, which is the new company that we acquired last year, they are now setting up a small workshop to see in what way can we enable for this in the small scale starting up. And then we send the people, Tommy or who is, you know, from Norway saying, putting up this workshop. So in that sense, we also are thinking a center of excellence logic, which does not mean that we need to be in the headquarters. It can be anywhere. We have best practices everywhere that we share. So investment needs to be done. Sustainability needs to be put in place to endurance and patience. And we need to have buy-in with all parties, also those participating in the programs. And there's a lot of other stuff also, so we can share. And I also would like to, talking about the culture again, and what we do when we buy new companies, we carefully pick management team. A new management team who's kind of grown up in Telenor, having kind of the embodiment of Telenor way culture, including equality, respect. And for instance, the Global case is actually that the CEO there is a long-term Telenor employee who has been in a lot of companies. This is of course driven by him because he thinks this is the way of work in Telenor, right? So then we also have the top management buy-in immediately. So that is also a little bit, recruitment here is also important for us. You know, we do it by intention. Yeah, and a lot of other stuff, so just call me if you...
Well, coming back to the lot of other stuff, I think we've given you a snapshot, and I'm sure there's lots of other things, and I do know because we've talked a lot over the last few years, particularly with both of your companies, about what you're doing. But I think in the 10 minutes before we hand over to our colleague from the OECD, if anyone from the audience has any questions, comments, oh dear, that you'd like to pick the brains of our three participants. Okay, can we start with the gentleman over there? And I'm very sorry, I don't know all of you, so if you could just announce your name and where you're from as well, just to help us.
Thank you. I'm John Kenneth Billingsley. I'm with Novartis Government and Public Affairs. And the point I want to make is obviously work of the private sector does not take place in isolation, and a supportive policy environment can do much to enable our collective effort to enable workplace embracing people with disabilities. This can be complicated, though, by the fact that diversity and inclusion is actually relevant to multiple parts of government, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Labor, and others, which do not necessarily see eye to eye. So my question to the panel is, what are your views or experience on how to break down government silos, not just company silos, but government silos, and enable a supportive environment for diversity and inclusion initiatives? Are there good examples of collaboration between ministries that you're aware of? Thank you.
Maybe I can take 2 or 3 questions, and then you can prepare your answers. Gentleman in the front.
Amar Khashoggi, Qadirun, Saudi Arabia. Just to follow up on the question before from my colleague from Novartis, I'm also interested in how do you collaborate with NGOs, you know, or even charity organizations that deal with persons with disability from childhood until they bring them to a working age. How do you manage that relationship?
I think I've got Marco, is it Marco? And then the gentleman behind Marco. So if we could just take those 2 and then we'll pass to a first round of answers.
Yes, thank you very much. Marco Ferri from the European Union. I will avoid the thanks, but thank to the ILO. I would like to thank you for organizing this high-level panel, and I will also avoid the presentation of what the European Union is doing on disability. Just let me tell you that we consider your network an excellent example of public-private partnership and a concrete sign of the commitment of employers to the enjoyment of human rights by persons with disabilities. Let me turn to the question. I would like the panelists, if they can share their experiences on the capacity of the network to deliver benefits for its members, in particular for large companies as opposed to small and medium enterprises. Thank you very much.
Erich Kofmel, Autistic Minority International. It is generally estimated that about 1% of the population of any given country is on the autism spectrum. People still think that autism only affects children, But the fact is that many adults were just never diagnosed as children. I myself was only diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome at age 38, for example. Many people who are in the workplace, who are autistic, don't disclose their autism for fear of discrimination. So they are often invisible in the workplace, they hide their autism, and people suffer in silence. It is what happens then is often that people will have a so-called middle-age burnout due to the stress that is caused by having to keep up this facade, this mask at all times. Creation of adapted autism-friendly workplaces currently only really happens in a few individual IT companies. So 75 to 90% of autistics are said to be out of work, many of them persons with Asperger's who could be employed with minimal reasonable accommodations that cost very little. On the other hand, we heard this suggestion about open space offices as a particularly disability-friendly solution, which for autism it is certainly not, because many of us have so-called sensory processing issues. They are strongly affected by things like lighting, sound, smells, noises, etc. So it's very stressful for us to work in open space offices. To come to my questions, do you know how many autistic persons already work in your companies, and what can you do to empower them to disclose their autism and ask for reasonable accommodations that they may require? And secondly, what do you do to create new workplaces for persons on the autism spectrum? Thank you.
I think what we'll do is pass to the panelists, and then I'm going to go off agenda and have a second round of questions, because I think I saw so many hands up. I hope you'll bear with me that we maybe go over a little bit. So please carry on.
Okay. I'll kind of taken on some notes on the questions that I got, and I'll try and answer as many as I could. Now, the first
I'll remind
question,
you if you forget.
The first question was in terms of influencing with the government, because there are multiple silos. And now, typically from our experience, what we try and do is, in today's world, focusing on including people with disability is not something very unique to a specific company. It is something which is across a group of companies, and typically as a company, what we do is we have created groups within different countries, and we try and approach that as an industry body. So to kind of give a specific example, within India, we have something called as NASSCOM, which is like the body for IT and ITES sector. And through them, because they are, then it's like one collective view of the industry, which we kind of try and put across to multiple ministries. But at least increasingly, we are seeing many governments having dedicated cells towards focusing on minorities and human rights areas. So that's one area that we kind of look at. But fundamentally, as an approach, what we look for is going with collective strength rather than as a specific company per se. Now, the other question was in terms of specific partnership with NGOs. So typically, in our case, we work with NGOs on two big areas. One is we work extensively with NGOs to hire people, because at least through them, there are a lot of work, good work is being done by multiple NGOs. When they get people from good schools, they train them, they get them employable. So we kind of have partnered with multiple NGOs to hire people. We also have partnered with quite a few NGOs to advise us on how to become more inclusive. Because as I've said, we're just about beginning a journey. We have a long way ahead for us as an organization. So we are partnered with quite a few agencies to advise us, so that how can we become more inclusive as an organization. And that's the second big area that we focus on. And the third thing that we look at, and that's also a slightly different division of Wipro which focuses on, we have a dedicated team called Azim Premji Foundation, which focuses on CSR. And that team does extensive amount of work with NGOs in terms of adopting villages, teaching school teachers, teaching students in villages. So significant amount of work which happens there. And the last question which I did, which was of a lot of interest to me personally, was how do we encourage people who are not willing to come forward to talk about their own disabilities. And as an organization, what we try and do is something that I've kind of talked about a little earlier. We can try and highlight successes of people. We try and make role models out of them. And it's a bit difficult, especially what we have seen is for existing set of people who are already there in the organization to come forward and talk about their own disability. But at least increasingly we are seeing a trend where at least the current generation of workforce, which is entering into the workplace, we find them a lot more comfortable talking about their own disabilities. And specific to workplace environment, we currently have just a couple of employees. So that's an issue that we are still struggling with. But from our perspective, we try and provide support from an infrastructure perspective to specific employees who come in with autism.
Yes. Many questions. Could have 2 days answering them, but we don't have that. We have maybe 1 minute. How to contribute to breaking down governmental silos? We are not able to do that, but we can through partnership, and we partner with different parts of the government and try to combine it, in our perspectives. But of course, that's an issue, and there's no silver bullet there either. But it's through stakeholder management, it's through contributing, it's through gaining partnerships with more than one, because we probably rely on more than one part of the government to be able to do this. So we are trying to make at least what we can do on our side by actively partnering with different parts of the government. When it comes to collaborating with NGOs, and as my colleague here says, we do a lot of collaboration with NGOs in all our companies, and again, kind of bringing our core competence and core capabilities, it's actually what you put into that partnership, We work with introducing school children to internet, getting them connected, getting them to use internet and get into distance learning. We do a lot of stuff related with both children, women, and have a lot of CSR activities on that, with kind of this in the core. How the network can provide benefit for us as an MNC. Of course, if we are able to share experiences and can also receive experiences, that will be the best way, because this is the game we're in. We need to share and we need to develop together, because challenges are the same and experiences are probably also the same. So instead of doing the same error everywhere, we can instead step up. So that is also kind of an introduction invitation to you guys. When it comes to the mental health issue, which is kind of really, in one sense, and the open space office is a very good example. It's not good for people who has those kinds of challenges. And we are very in the beginning of working with mental health issues. And we have a few people, right, Ingrid, which is the director, yes, in our program in Norway. And it's a very complex task. When it comes to how many people in the regular employee who has that, we don't know, because we don't ask people that question. But of course, there are many people. Just given kind of the statistics, we know there are people doing that. So what we then need to do is to work through the line and employee-manager relationship, So we have we do, as every company, we do employee engagement service each year, focusing on stress, work-life balance, HSSE issues. We have a yearly minimum, but also quarterly dialogue between the employee and manager, where they are going to talk about how work-life is. And hopefully those issues will be captured there. We have a lot of training on managers to help and deal with different forms of employee challenges. So that's kind of the line manager approach that we need to enable and make even more strong on that part. And on top of that, we also are working with trying to give some good cases on people with mental health issues coming in through the programs. And once again, because when I receive, as a line manager, I'm also a line manager, so every time a new program has finished, I get the kind of a nice PowerPoint presentation of all the candidates of 2014, of which some of them also have similar issues and challenges. And then it's very clearly stated in the kind of presentation, I have this and this and this. This means that I need maybe to sit at home 2 times a week because I'm stressed of the open space office. So that's kind of the third part of it, the virtual working possibilities, that we actually can work from wherever. And when we talk about open space office, that's not only tearing down the walls, but it's flexible offices. It's different small rooms. You're not all in one big room like this. So there are flexibility built in to create more private rooms where people who need to take some time out actually can do that. So I'm not trying to take away the fact that open space office drives work-life balance issues, but it's also possible to find kind of mitigations on that part.
Ronnie, have you got any comments, perhaps particularly on the first question about governmental silos, but also the M&E to SME learnings?
Well, on the question of governmental silos, I'll just add to the lament, really, rather than provide an answer. From a corporate perspective, the issue isn't even just who to go to in the government, or that different things are going on, sometimes contradictory or not necessarily complementary things are going on within different departments. It's that the proliferation of outcomes from all of this makes it very hard for companies to manage. And the area of diversity is a particularly good example of that, because what you find yourself confronted with, or what companies find themselves confronted with, is one set of quotas or goals or targets that apply, let's say, to people with disabilities. Then there's another set of goals and targets on quotas for example, women on boards, corporate boards, and so on and so forth. So the whole issue of diversity, by definition, involves lots of different groups with lots of different needs, lots of different challenges. And that's another part of what makes the issue you raise such a difficult and important one. I'll just, so much has already been said, I don't need to repeat it, but I'll just say on the issue of the value proposition, what is the ability of the network to deliver benefits? There are a lot of companies in this room. That tells me that there's a value proposition here for companies. They wouldn't be here otherwise. They wouldn't be contributing their money and their sweat equity, as we like to say in the United States. So I think we've heard already a lot of the benefits and how much potential there is, not just in big companies learning from each other, but from multinationals carrying the best practices in their operations around the world, in dealing with the local business communities where they do business, and in employer organizations, those that have small and medium enterprises, where the most bang for the buck is going to be educating and helping to engage their constituencies.
If I can make an advert for my day job, one of the things that we find difficult in the Bureau for Employer Activities, because part of our day job is to work with business representative organisations to help them become strong, representative and independent. Not always easy, particularly in an environment where business and all sorts of collective organisations are changing. They've got different challenges. But one thing I think is clear, the value of having a message and resembling the business voice is even more important for these organisations now. And I've been very surprised in that we have a list of organisations that we've not been able to work with. They're not interested in our offer. They've not been interested in an ILO agenda, if I'm being very frank with you. And we've been able to get traction with those organisations on this as a policy issue, which is quite interesting because it has enabled learning from you guys, to then translate through a business environment in a different country. And for those organizations, and I think Ravi, you talked about it, but you're probably at the vanguard of this in terms of policy advocacy, but also service provision to your members. But we're beginning in certain countries, Saudi Arabia being one, to work with the Chamber to start on the service provision and the advocacy. So it's opened up a slightly different avenue for my colleagues in their day job too, to start working on some of these issues. So perhaps the PPP value goes beyond the value of the network. What I'm going to do now, because my minders have whispered in my ear, is pass the floor to Shruti, who's a member of the OECD's Employment, Labour and Social Affairs Directorate, who will speak on the issue of mental health at work, particularly from the perspective of myths and realities. And therefore, once she's finished speaking, questions to Shruti, very welcome. But if I can also ask the panelists to stay, because we maybe also scoop up any additional questions that you have. Meeting participants are invited to a lunch, and my colleagues will see you where through that is. So I'm hoping that we will also be able to follow up some of these conversations over a bite to eat between 1 and 2 before you finish your network meeting later on this afternoon. Huh? Thank you. Shruti, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Deborah. Let me first begin by saying that it's really a great pleasure to be here today, and I would sincerely like to thank the steering committee of the ILO Global Business and Disability Network and the organizers for the event to introduce the topic of mental health and work. It is a topic that has been neglected for far too long due to widespread stigma, taboos, and fear. And at the same time, it has become one of the most important economic challenges facing us today, because potentially it concerns each and every one of us, and because of the very large cost it imposes on individuals and society as a whole. So in the next 15 minutes or so, I'll try to be as brief as possible. We're approaching lunchtime, so I'm aware of that. What I'd like to do is to give you a little bit of an overview of the work the OECD has done up until now on the issue of disability, mental health, and employment. Talk about what I mean by mental ill health. Make a business case or the economic case for the rationale for intervention. Move on to discussing one of the most important policy areas that we've identified in our work, which is the role of working conditions, the role of employers, and the workplace, which needs to change rapidly if we were to see improved outcomes in this area. Actually, I should add that there are some handouts which I'll be closely following, and there are a couple of charts in there that might appear a little bit complex. I'd like to spend a bit more time in going through them. So if you have that would be great. So like the ILO, the OECD started to work on the issue of disability and employment almost, well, more than a decade ago now, when the OECD governments realized the economic relevance of the issue, and because of the very high and fast rising cost associated with sickness and disability schemes across the OECD countries, but also because concerns about a very significant proportion of the workforce leaving the labor market altogether because of going on to these benefits in the context of aging population. So the first report was published in 2003, Transforming Disability into Ability. And back then, when we looked at the countries, we concluded that no country was doing well, and perhaps this is the worst area that we've seen in terms of social and labor market policy failures. So saying this gave us the mandate to carry on more specific, in-depth country reviews, from which we gathered in-depth evidence and brought it together in a synthesis report entitled Breaking the Barriers. This was released with OECD ministers back in 2010, and the main conclusion from this report was that one area that still remains unresolved is that of mental ill health at the workplace. So in 2010, we launched a new project on this very topic, and we began by putting some evidence together in our report, Sick on the Job, Myths and Realities about Mental Ill Health. And the purpose of the report was twofold. First, to increase the very thin evidence base there is on this topic at the moment, and second, to raise the awareness among policymakers, as well as the private sector, like the employers, many employers here today. So what do we mean by mental ill health? I can assure you there are a lot of misconceptions related to the way mental ill health is being understood. For example, most people would often think of a very small, narrow group. They will often think of diagnoses such as schizophrenia. But I think what we're saying is this misses the point. We're talking about mental ill health in a very broad sense, including people with mild to moderate mental disorders such as depression, anxiety, severe cases of burnout and work-related stress, which can get better over time with the right treatment. And who is affected by it? Like I said at the beginning, potentially every one of us. Mental ill health affects some 20 to 25% of the working age population. This is 1 in 5 people of working age in the OECD area. However, the lifetime prevalence is the double of that. So 1 in 2 of us are likely to suffer from a mental disorder during the life course. Why do we need to care? Why should we care? What is the business case here? Well, mental ill health comes with a very high cost. Estimates from our studies and from the ILO have shown that it costs around 3 to 4% of GDP every year. This is a pretty large number. And to your surprise, the majority of these costs are not borne in the health sector through care, but instead by the employment sector, as you will see in the next, in the next few slides. But particularly, these costs are borne by employers themselves. So these costs are borne through very significant losses of potential labor supply. The employment rates of people with common mental disorders are 10 to 15 percentage points lower than their counterparts without mental disorders. And at the same time, people with mental disorders are likely to lose their jobs rather quickly. They struggle to hold on to their jobs if they manage to get a job at the first place. The unemployment rate of this group is on average 2 to 3 times the rate of people with no mental disorder. Third, mental ill health reduces labor supply as it's a major factor for inactivity. What we've observed across the OECD countries is that more and more people are claiming new sickness and disability benefits due to reasons of mental ill health. Not musculoskeletal diseases, but now stress, depression has become the main driver for excluding people from the labor market. And finally, mental health problems can drive labor productivity downwards, which has major implications on company competitiveness, but also on the long-term economic growth of the society as a whole. And we've looked into the issue of productivity via 2 main indicators, the first one being sickness absence. And here I'd like to, for you to pay attention a little bit on the chart, which shows that if we look at the first chart on sickness absence, here you have the percentage of people that have been absent in the past 4 weeks, depending or not whether they have a mental disorder. And what we see is that workers with mental health problems are absent from work more often, and if they are sick, they are absent from work much longer, which is shown in the second chart. But this is not the whole story, because many people do not take sick leave, but instead may be underperforming in their work. And this chart on the right-hand side doesn't show people who are absent, but those who have accomplished less in the last 4 weeks. And again, what we see is that around 70% of all workers with mental health problems report reduced productivity at work, compared to only 26% of workers without a mental disorder. So we're talking about huge productivity losses. So I think this final point of productivity losses at the workplace brings me nicely into my next section, which is about what is the role of working conditions, the workplace, and employers. I'd like to begin this section by looking at the evidence on changing working conditions. Have working conditions changed over time? What do we know about that? From the OECD survey that we have, the conclusion is that the picture is rather mixed. If you look at the chart on working conditions, on the left-hand side, you have two standard indicators of what we call atypical work. This is temporary work, fixed-term contracts. So on the first bar, you have the increase in the incidence of temporary work, and about 12% of workers in the OECD are involved in this kind of work. But there's a huge heterogeneity in some countries like Southern Europe, Italy, and Spain, or even in the Far East, Japan and Korea. The proportion of people holding temporary jobs is in fact very, very large. The second bar shows the increase in part-time work. Greater flexibility in work time arrangements have allowed certain groups to get into the labor market. For example, part-time work has improved labor market prospects of women to combine work and family responsibilities together, but it's also allowed opportunities for young workers to combine education and work together. But sometimes part-time work is not chosen, and it's involuntary because people cannot find full-time jobs. Let's move to the center of the chart. This part shows the results of a survey undertaken among individuals about how they feel about their working environment. So when you ask people how they see how complex, for example, their jobs have become over time, what we see is that there's been a drop in the number of people reporting how complex their jobs have become, but the share remains significant. Around 60% people say they're still dealing or having to do with very complex tasks. The proportion of workers that report low autonomy at the workplace has increased, and at the same time, the overall job satisfaction has fallen over time. So how do these working conditions actually relate to work-related stress or mental health? What we've done in our work is we've tried to find some links. So for example, in the first chart, you have two dimensions. On the horizontal axis, you have the changes in work-related stress as reported by workers over the past decade. And what we see is in almost all countries, stress at work has increased as perceived by workers. And on the left-hand side, you have people that perceived to have low satisfaction on the job. So if we put the two together, what we see is a strong correlation. So in some ways, we can say that stress comes from the fact that people are not satisfied with their jobs anymore. And if you do something similarly and plot work-related stress with low autonomy at work, again, we see a strong relationship with people reporting high levels of low autonomy correlated strongly with work-related stress. So there are some dimensions of our working environment that can lead to stress and mental health. But having said that, is all stress bad? I think the answer is no. And stress is part of our lives, especially our working lives. But the problem comes when stress is translated into something what we call job strain, which is a situation when workers are faced with very high psychological demands combined with very little autonomy of their work. And job strain in itself can aggravate underlying symptoms of mental health problems or worsen the problems people have. But again, mental health is quite a complex issue. Very rarely mental disorders or depression is caused only by work-related factors or your working environment. In fact, it's a mixture of something that could have happened in an individual's childhood, non-work-related factors such as your personal life. And while workplace factors can contribute to unhealthy stress or lead to mental health problems, let me emphasize that our research and research from other organizations have consistently shown that having a job or being in employment is good for persons' health, especially their mental health. Evidence, for example, shows that the unemployed are twice as likely to report mental health problems than those who are employed. However, the type of employment also matters. Non-standard work, for example, temporary contracts or long working hours, shift work, low job security, have all been shown to deteriorate mental health. So in short, a good job is good for mental health and well-being. What can employers do? Is there a light in the tunnel here? We've collected quite a lot of evidence from our country-specific studies. Most of this does come from the industrialized world, but I think some of the lessons can be easily translated into other countries, members of the ILO. So, evidence on what works in mental health is generally still poor, but we came with a few directions in which workplaces and employers ought to move towards. For example, there needs to be considerable attention to psychosocial workplace. For example, monitoring, identifying the work pressures, working hours, but also providing multidisciplinary support at the workplace to people who are at risk, but also who are already suffering from mental health problems. And this should combine both occupational health and psychological services. It's interesting, somebody asked the question at the end of the panel we just had. There's a silo thinking here between employment and the health sector. And again, this is very important if we want to see improved outcomes. Often employers ignore and focus on how to get people back into jobs by changing working conditions, but actually many of them would need genuine treatment and are in need of psychological support. So it needs to be integrated support, multidisciplinary support. High up on the agenda needs to be addressing stigma and discrimination. It's very, very high, already very high in the developed world. I can imagine this to be even higher in some other countries. Raising awareness and competence among management and employees is another critical part of the process. Line managers are the first point of contact for employees, for them to discuss their mental health problems. And finally, systematic monitoring of sick leave behavior with appropriate return to work support are key elements of a good workplace strategy. Now, just to illustrate and give you some examples from countries that we have reviewed how they are addressing some of these policies. Belgium, for example, has a very strong legislation for employers who are legally obliged to take preventative measures to protect the well-being of their employees. The law gives explicit instructions on how to deal with mental health problems. So it's not just about focusing on work injuries or the physical elements, but in fact going much beyond to what we typically see in legislation at the moment, which focuses on physical disabilities only. So there needs to be a move towards addressing mental health conditions. So employers are required to take risk assessments, how to identify the risk factors or working conditions that are contributing towards deteriorating mental health. And employers must establish a 5-year global prevention plan to avoid psychological distress. The Netherlands, quite an interesting country. They have very strong legislation for employers to pay up to 2 years of sick leave, which gives them a very strong incentive to make sure that they minimize sick leave, but also intervene to ensure that people return to work very, very quickly. And finally, in the UK, the Department of Health, not Employment, in fact, has established a mental health first aid kit. So this is moving away not from the typical first aid kit we know, but tailoring it to people with mental health concerns. This kit basically provides, it's a 2-day course that's offered to line managers and to employers to recognize the signs and symptoms of common mental disorders. So just to conclude now very quickly that, like I said, the topic has been neglected for far too long. There's still very high stigma associated with it, but at the same time, countries are increasingly recognizing this as a major economic and societal challenge. And I think, finally, to reiterate this integrated policy, if we were to see improvements in this area, we need action from both the employment, the health sector in going forward and in making policies. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Shruti. I think you've raised so many issues that we could probably have 2 days just on this, and that would just be an initial go around some of the issues. I think I want to start where you left off, in that this is, and even from an ILO perspective, has perhaps been a neglected policy area. And in the network, we've not really addressed this issue yet, although I know through personal experience, I've been involved as an observer in a personal capacity in a group of companies at European level who are precisely looking at some of the issues you just raised in terms of support to line managers, how to tackle a growing issue from an employer perspective, but in an integrated approach with public authorities. I'm hoping my minders are going to let us go over a little bit. Would that be okay to our signer? I know you've been working very hard. Would that be okay? Thank you. Perhaps 5-10 minutes. Any questions to Shruti, and any comments to the final panel? I'm going to let Ronnie abuse her position, if I may, at the end.
Shruti, thank you. That was fascinating. My question has to do with the role and the particular contribution that the OECD makes to our policy world, which is that it is, I think, first and foremost, a place for objective data gathering and research. And it strikes me that this area is one that presents particular challenges for that. You talked about how broadly, or the vast range of issues, behaviors, problems that the term mental health covers. I'd venture to say that if not every single person, but most people, I certainly fit in this category, have been depressed, have felt stressed, have felt anxious, and on any given day that might affect my productivity or my performance on my job. But I wouldn't say of myself I have a mental health problem that raises to the kinds of challenges you've been talking about. But how do we investigate the line between, or the continuity between that situation that virtually every person in the world experiences, and identify where, at what point this becomes a workplace issue? How are you grappling with the definitional and the research aspects of that challenge?
Perhaps I can just open up the floor, perhaps to 2 or 3 questions, and then Shruti can take them together. You were quick, Madame, if you'd like to go first.
Thank you. Here's Ingo Teinor from the Zero Project. Yes, it's rather a comment than a question. Very quick. I'm very glad to see on the panel Telenor and Vipro, which were 2 innovative practices which we highlighted in the Zero Project report 2013. And we had also Ingrid Ime and Isaac George at our Zero Project conference in Vienna in 2013, with which we collaborated also with the ILO, Barbara Murray. And I would like just to make a comment on the mental health, because this is something which we found in our policy research, particularly on employment for persons with disabilities, a real challenge. Yes, I really see that governments are really struggling with finding good policies, and especially the area of mental health is really challenging one for them. And we highlighted one policy from the UK, maybe you know about it probably, the Individual Placement and Support Program, which basically embeds employment specialists in clinical treatment teams, because the majority of people who have mental health problems complain that they do not receive the services they need to retain their employment. And with this program, 61% of persons with psychosocial disabilities can successfully gain open competitive employment, compared with 23% for traditional vocational rehabilitation services. So I think the work you do is really important, and if employers can do something to help that, that would be great. Thanks.
No? Can I, because there's a lady there who hasn't asked, but we can maybe come to you later.
Thank you. Actually, it is not a question. It is kind of comment. I am Hala El Tahir. I am from the Egyptian mission. Actually, because I heard many people talking about the regulations and the government involvement. But it is not enough. We had a regulation that enterprises should hire people with special needs. And I am not going to talk about the challenge in implementing this regulation, but I would rather talk about who implemented this regulation and hired people with special needs. After they hired those people, we had many complaints that they are giving them their salaries, but they ask them to stay at home. So they were very offended. And actually, the law couldn't tackle this problem. So I think what we need is informing enterprises. We need a sort of campaign for enterprises to know that this will not harm their enterprises. They should know what you said, that they may gain benefits of hiring people with special needs. Thank you so much.
That's indeed one of the reasons behind the network and the work we're trying to do. Shruti, would you like to?
I think there was only one real question, so I'll try to address that. How do we identify and when do we intervene? I think given the prevalence is so high, it's about prevention. This is the message we're giving. Prevention is better than cure. We know that mental ill health, the onset is on the average around age of 14. So in our reports, what we've done is in our studies, we're actually taking a life cycle approach. We're saying that we need to already start in our schools when at very early on as a preventative action to already fill in the gaps or the needs that people might have developed early on. And if we, and it's quite a complex challenge, because even if you have a mental health problem, for example, often you don't know it yourself, so it makes intervention very, very complex. Again, at the workplace, it's not about picking one individual and then saying, here, you need this and that. But actually, if we could mainstream the topic and provide mainstream services that should somebody, people who are at risk or those who already have acquired an illness, there should be the right appropriate services, appropriate referrals. Line managers should know where to, if somebody comes to them, where can they be referred to, what are the companies' ethics that we have, what are the services that we have in-house, what are the services that we have outside. So it's really taking this broad prevention approach that's otherwise I think becomes very difficult to pinpoint and try to take each and every individual. So I think for us prevention is definitely the way to go forward.
Thank you. Just thinking around this session, I'm left with a couple of thoughts. our original idea of having the panel during the network meeting, Gerard, I think you agree with me, was to provide a snapshot to a wider audience. And I hope we've achieved that, but I think perhaps we've tried to cram too much in, so we need to have a discussion about how we might do it in a slightly different way another time if there's interest. But I'd like to, on your behalf, thank the panellists for giving up their time and to share their experiences with us. It's not an easy thing to do, and to be honest about successes and failures, and I think you've mentioned that this morning. But I think they've brought over, in a very real-world way, just some of the challenges. Hopefully, in an ILO context, being able to show that this is a policy area that businesses are taking seriously and are working on a day-to-day basis. So thank you. We appreciate it. And before we break for lunch, I'd like to thank my staff, who you've not met but have been beavering away to make sure that everything ran smoothly, and if they don't, tell Sarah, not me. And our signers, who've been working very hard this morning. Thank you very much for your input. And finally, one last comment. The ILO is like many organisations, but we take it to an nth degree. We don't do working together, we don't do partnership. I'm sitting up here this morning, but one of the things on a day-to-day basis I've been really excited about working on this project about is that it's probably one of the few jointly collaborative efforts across the ILO. We don't work together enough. I can't do what my policy colleagues in the global, the Gender, Disability and Equality branch do. They're the policy people, not me. I'm just the mouth. So I really just wanted to thank them for their continued support and input, because we couldn't make this network work without their technical input, and I hope that they get something out of it too. And can I invite meeting participants to join us for lunch? Sarah, Stefan, Henrik, are you going to sort of shepherd people down? Thank you very much. And where you can grab maybe the companies that you may have existing questions over a lunch, and see, Gerard, those of you who might be interested in joining us in future network activities. Yes. And thank you to you for giving up your time. Thank you. Thank you.